The sun beat down on the savannah with a harsh light, gilding the parched plains and transforming the air into a vibrant mirage. The heat made the horizon tremble as if the ground itself were breathing. Amidst the shadows of the scattered acacia, trees, the silence was almost absolute. Only the distant rustle of wings and the muffled murmur of insects broke the monotony. And it was in this scene of immense stillness that an unusual figure appeared. Albino lion, colossal, with a calm gait and a gaze that seemed to contain ancient wisdom. His white fur reflected the sunlight as if it were made of bone dust, and each step he took sent the dust swirling. In front of him, amid the yellowing vegetation, lay a man. His hands were tied with rough ropes, his knees planted on the dry ground, his body sweaty and covered in dust. He was a hunter, dressed in torn clothes, his face burned by the sun and his eyes fixed on the silent approach of the animal he had tried so many times to capture. The savannah, silent witness to countless hunts, now reversed its roles. Predator and prey had switched places, and fate seemed to rewrite the laws of the African desert before everyone's eyes. The wind shifted, bringing with it the bittersweet smell of hot earth and the faint aroma of dried blood. The lion lifted its head and sniffed the air, recognizing the human presence. Its muscles moved beneath its pale skin like taut strings, and the deep sound of its breathing caused the nearest birds to take flight in astonishment. The tension was total, the instant before the inevitable. The hunter trembled. His breath was short and irregular, and beads of sweat ran down his temple, mingling with the dust. His gaze of supplication and terror met the lion's serene, unfathomable gaze, and between them lay only the echo of everything that had once been inverted between predator and victim. All around, nature seemed to stand still. Giraffes watched motionless from a distance, hyenas peered from behind the bushes, birds interrupted their songs. The silence of the savannah was almost sacred, as if all creatures were aware of witnessing something beyond mere survival. The lion took a step forward, then another. Each movement caused the ground to vibrate slightly and dust to rise in gentle spirals. The hunter closed his eyes instinctively, but the expected sound, the roar, the leap, the blow, never came. The animal stood before him, imposing, a few meters away. The sun, now at a lower angle, painted its mane with an almost supernatural golden glow. The ancient scars on its back told stories of battles, ambushes, and survival. He stared at the bound man for long seconds, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The contrast between absolute power and total vulnerability reached its peak, a moment when the very notion of justice seemed to be embodied by that white, silent being. In the background, a group of rangers appeared, running through the dust, alerted by signs of a fight and abandoned tire tracks. When they caught sight of the scene, they stopped in shock. The spectacle unfolding before them was something beyond rational explanation. The tied-up man, the human symbol of predation, and before him the rarest and most feared lion in the region, motionless, contemplative as if judging its tormentor. The wind carried the smell of weapons, but none of the rangers dared raise their rifles. The feeling was of being confronted with something that must not be interrupted. The lion moved slowly, approaching until its snout was almost touching the man. The heat in the air seemed to increase, and the dust stirred up formed a luminous halo around them both. The hunter, motionless, seemed petrified by the weight of his own guilt. The animal tilted its head, taking in every detail of its defeated foe, the hands marked with dried blood, the boots stained with mud and gunpowder, the eyes that no longer challenged anyone. Then, with impossible calm, the lion gave a low, hoarse roar that echoed like distant thunder. The sound echoed across the plain, piercing the bodies and hearts of all who witnessed the scene. It was a roar that expressed not rage, but rather a kind of proclamation, as if nature were proclaiming a verdict. That roar carried centuries of broken balance, of unjust hunts, of blood spilled without purpose. It was the sound of the scales being tipped back, and in that instant, everyone understood. The savannah was punishing, but it was also forgiving. The lion, after roaring, took a step back. He looked one last time at the kneeling man and unhurriedly turned. He walked toward the horizon, his silhouette blending into the golden afternoon light. The dust kicked up by his paws seemed to form a shimmering cloak, and for a brief moment his image seemed to dissolve into the warm air, as if he were an ancient spirit returning to the wind. The guards, still stunned, approached the hunter, who remained motionless like a living statue of regret and astonishment. The sound of their footsteps seemed to break the spell of the moment. The lion had already vanished. All that remained was the smell of the earth, the respectful silence of the animals, and the memory of an encounter that defied all known rules. As the sun sank behind the distant hills, the camera, or the narrative gaze, slowly rose, revealing the man's frail body, bound, surrounded by the vastness of the savannah. Nature resumed its cycle, indifferent and sovereign. On the horizon, a dust storm gathered, as if the entire earth breathed a sigh of relief. And the narrator concludes the thought that had been hanging in the air. The albino lion had found the hunter tied up in the savannah, and what happened next truly shocked everyone. Fate had reversed its roles, and the savannah, silent, had just witnessed an act of justice that no human words could explain. The day had begun with a deceptive calm, as if the savannah was breathing slowly before a jolt. The first light filtered through the acacia canopies and lit small embers in the eyes of the perched birds. Herds moved along familiar trails in an ancient choreography that seemed impervious to time. Overhead, vultures circled lazily, not out of hunger but out of habit. The plain took on the appearance of perfect order. It was in this framework of false harmony that the stories of all involved silently converged. On the eastern edge of the territory, rangers inspected observation posts. They were few in number, tired, with worn vehicles and scribbled maps, but they knew every fold of the terrain. They knew that the dry season forced animals to concentrate in scarce pools, and that this predictability also attracted those willing to turn life into trophies. In crumpled notebooks, they noted herd movements, the occasional disappearance of a trap, signs of a cart, scraps of rope. They seemed like random details until they began to form a line. Further south, Eric's camp rose with cold efficiency. Camouflage nets, boxes, steel traps, a noisy generator. The man had designed a small empire of control there, made of secret routes, intermediaries, and invisible buyers. His notes listed weights, measures, and values. Nothing escaped the logic of inventory. Beside him, his practical and silent assistant, organized tools with the precision of someone who knew the business and its risks. There was, however, something that eluded them both. A shifting territory, saturated with signals that didn't fit into spreadsheets. In the heart of the domain, the albino lion roamed with the confidence of someone who had become a reference. The guards called him Cairo, though he needed no name. He was a living legend to some, superstition to others, and an object of obsession to those who saw him as a rare prize. He avoided contact, but patrolled invisible borders, alert for metallic smells, fresh marks, human interference in the pattern of the wind. The ancient order vibrated within him like a sharp instinct. Every pronounced footprint, every fracture in the grass, every misplaced silence. The first strange signs appeared without warning. A young elephant appeared dead near a stream, with no obvious wounds. Days later, 2 tracking collars disappeared from wooden columns, despite being secured with locks. Further on, human trails crossed directly with feline paths, as if someone were trying to provoke forced encounters. For some, coincidences. For others the tip of a line leading to a disturbing center. The fuse shattered the stillness of a clear morning sky. A vital pool appeared, with no trace of footprints around it, as if the place had been swept clean. The earth showed arcing scratches, rope marks, interrupted footsteps. The nearby cameras, installed weeks earlier, had been broken by precise blows. On the supports, someone had etched an irregular symbol, a hurried circle intersected by two lines like a signature. The feeling that remained was that of a message. The savannah, which always spoke in whispers, seemed to have screamed here. The guards tried to reinforce routes and reorganize shifts. They assessed known suspects, reviewed fuel purchase records, and mapped metal dealerships. There wasn't enough time and manpower, so they repeated what had always worked. More patience, more listening to the terrain. The wind began to carry odors of oil and gunpowder from spots where before there had been only sun-scorched grass. Some nights, the crackling sounds of drought sounded like restrained footsteps, and the distant roar ripped through the seams of sleep. In Eric's camp, confidence was like armor. The man organized an ambitious hunt, noting routes that cut through the north, where the sparse vegetation favored quick attacks. He spoke little, but thought a lot. He was certain he understood the animals' patterns, the exact time when hunger made them predictable, the angle that reduced risk. In the margin of a notebook, a name in thick, trembling letters, the White Lion. The goal crystallized in his mind, the fixed idea that transforms the landscape into a labyrinth. On the other side of this board, Cairo modulated his paths. He avoided trails of fresh human scent, but marked with presence the intersections where cubs and females passed. His dominance wasn't just strength. It was a fine reading of the weather, the water level, the moon's trajectory. At some points he stopped on discrete reliefs, as if calculating distances and possibilities. At others, he intercepted the scent of metal and the tension of leather, signs of traps masked under leaves. He didn't step on them. He skirted around them. At times, he pushed stones with his chest or flank, discreetly displacing triggers. It was a tiny, almost invisible movement, but enough to cause the steel to fail. Signs intensified. A set of trail photos recorded human footprints circling the guards' camp without anyone seeing any intruders. The shadow of a pickup truck appeared on a hill, disappeared, and reappeared on the opposite side in minutes that couldn't be explained by a road. At a lookout, someone had left an empty bottle of imported water with dust on the outside and a thread of fine sand inside. Sand that didn't correspond to that stretch of ground. As if someone was testing their responsiveness, prowling, weighing, and measuring holes in the routines. Still, resistance prevailed. Among the guards, among the hunters, among those who simply wanted to keep working without escalating conflicts. When people depend on a certain normalcy to get through the day, they tend to downplay the discomfort of reality. It was said that traps broke from rust, that collars came loose from wear, that cameras failed from excessive heat. The brain, so adapted to stitching together explanations, preferred patches to admitting the entire tear. Meanwhile, the landscape changed in small spasms. The main watercourse receded meagerly, compressing encounters of species into muddy islands. The dust rose earlier and settled later. The nights came charged with dry electricity, making hair stand on end. And amidst this stretched canvas, a line of events traced the outline of what was to come. A puddle swept, a marked mark, a trap neutralized, a patrol car that always failed at the same kilometer, an antenna that lost signal when it was needed most. Then came the rupture. On a cloudless afternoon, a group of hyenas was seen prowling a clearing where impalas usually passed. There was commotion but no game. Instead, silence fell suddenly. In the center of the clearing, dragging marks indicated that something heavy had been dislodged. Human tracks led to the shade of a lone tree and stopped. From there on, only circular marks on the ground, as if small wheels had spun around a single point. The smell of old sweat and damp rope mingled with the grass. The clearing which in other days was a shortcut, had become a stage. The false peace had ended there without warning. Eric disappeared from the maps for hours that felt like days. His assistant vanished before that, leaving behind essential tools and an uncovered box. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to tilt, a group of birds passed low, startled, and the entire savannah seemed to shift. The rangers quickened their pace, guided by markings that now stood out. The routine had been shattered. The savannah, once a backdrop, had crossed the frame and taken over the narrative. At day's end, the horizon held the promise of an encounter that would rewrite places. Ordinary life, the one everyone pretended to maintain, had crumbled before signs that only made sense when seen in sequence. Balance was a mirage, awakening inevitable. The next piece was already in place. A man, a tree, ropes, dust, and the silent movement of a white guardian advancing, not by chance, but by destiny of the territory. What had been announced as routine was finally revealed as a prelude to judgment. The news of Eric's disappearance spread like a silent wave, distorting the surface of everyday life. The following hours were filled with hurried triage, map revisions, and cross-referencing old notes with recent markings on the ground. At the ranger's base, the park biologist stood at a makeshift table, stacking memory cards, sweat-soaked notebooks, and trap identification sheets. The heat seemed to glue the air to the walls, and the hum of the generator served as a constant reminder that nothing there was stable. As the first batch of images recovered from the damaged cameras uploaded, an invisible arc began to close over the story. The central object wasn't a single piece, but a whole that fit together with the precision of an ancient mechanism. In a sequence of grainy frames, a pale feline appeared at the edge of the lens, so white the sensor nearly burst. The camera shook with the wind, yet the animal could be seen approaching a steel noose covered in leaves. Instead of stepping, the lion pushed a branch with its chest, dislodged a rock with its flank, and the shutter missed without closing. Elsewhere, the same white fur bent behind stakes and pushed with minimal movements, the counterweight that held a noose suspended. There was no accident in those actions. There was a reading of space, trial and error, an economy of gesture. The images seemed to bear witness to a pact between instinct and learning. The biologist also gathered screenshots of the collar of a young elephant monitored months earlier. The animal's usual path, drawn as a smooth line through the valley, presented a sudden interruption, exactly where the puddle had been swept. A gap in the coordinates corresponded to the times when the rangers had found wheel tracks, and the symbol cut into the ground. Alongside the GPS readings, the records seized from Eric's camp listed ivory weights, pay scales, departure and arrival times. In the stained margin, a note about a rare target appeared without the animal's name. It was all concrete evidence, and yet it seemed too unlikely to be accepted without resistance. When the material began to circulate among the team, denial came immediately, instinctive, almost reflexive. Some attributed the sequence of videos to coincidence. The wind, the rocks, the precariousness of the mechanisms could explain the trap's failure. Others said the quality of the images could lead to interpreting as intention what was actually chance. Some pointed out that, at the height of the drought, any animal would learn to avoid danger through repetition. The human mind, trained to see the world as a set of simple causes, placed a wall between the data and the conclusion. It was more comfortable to deny active intelligence than to admit that the savannah responded, in its own way, to human interference. The biologist persisted in assembling the evidence network. She compared the times of the lion's passage with the loss of signal from the antennas. She noticed that the blackouts coincided with the presence of Eric's portable generator in external perimeters, as if someone knew how to cut off communication to avoid leaving a digital trail. She marked with red pins on the map the points where symbols were engraved in the ground and drew lines that passed through paths used by females with cubs. The resulting geometry created an invisible border, a defensive perimeter around sensitive areas. The object of the discovery was no longer just proof of lion action, but the revelation of a tactic that protected the savannah from the outside in. This persistence came at a cost. Eric's assistant, until then treated as a contingent source, began denying the authenticity of the notes. He said in scant reports that the lists were old, that his boss had become obsessed and lost his mind, that the gang had been dismantled months earlier. In narrow corridors and side conversations, whispers questioned the biologist's ability to distinguish evidence from hypothesis. The isolation crept in quietly, like a shadow lengthening in the late afternoon. Invitations to patrols were withdrawn. The radio failed more often for one receiver than for others. On the bulletin board, patrol sectors were reassigned without consulting who had the most data. The villain's mask, however, remained intact. Eric, absent and now reduced to mere traces, continued to be referred to in closed circles as a professional who knew the ways of the savannah like few others. Intermediaries insisted he had provided predator control services to remote farms, as if his image were that of someone who balanced interests, not that of a black market predator. The notes implicating him were reclassified as drafts. The marks on the ground were treated as vandalism by opportunists. The body of evidence continued to shine on the table, but trained eyes refused to be blinded. In the shadow of these refusals, the veiled threat surfaced. One morning, the biologist found her field notebook out of place, its pages crumpled, and a grain of fine sand trapped between leaves she hadn't visited. A map marker had been moved a few centimeters, enough to alter a suggested route. An easy trail led to a clearing where the earth was freshly dug. A deactivated snare lay beneath a shallow carpet of leaves, and beside it, remnants of rope cut with a clean blade. It wasn't an animal trap. It was bait for people. The warning settled in her body like a chill on a dry day. The territory had responded, and now the human who had dared to interpret the response had also been chosen as an interlocutor. Despite this, the public surface remained calm. Official reports highlighted the need for more maintenance, technical inspections of equipment, and rotating shifts. Administrative language kept the world habitable, while the underground of facts ran at a different speed. The lion continued its rounds, and new images showed it standing in front of a shallow water trough, as if weighing the risk and reward of remaining exposed. The white of its coat, contrasting with the opaque mud, transformed each frame into a symbol. For those who wanted to see, there was the figure of truth waiting to be recognized. For those who feared a paradigm shift, all they had to do was look away. Late one afternoon, the biologist lined up all the pieces on a tarp. Cards with date and timestamps, maps with lines, photographs of footprints in logical sequence, weighing sheets, lists seized from the camp. The first solid revelation was consolidated. The entire savannah formed a testament. The repetition of the lion's gestures before the traps, the coincidence of blackouts with human roots, the engraved symbol where cameras had been broken, the protective circle around cub areas, all pointed in the same direction. It was impossible to ignore without violating one's own senses. The team split. Some preferred to believe the whole thing was circumstantial. Some, small and silent, grasped the scale of what lay before them. The biologist in the center experienced the loneliness of someone holding the thread of a fabric most want to keep unraveling. The radio crackled when it needed to be clear. Her assigned truck broke down twice on the same stretch of road, and the tools in her field kit appeared out of place. The warning had become a message. There was still no explicit threat, but the combination of signals said there were lines that should not be crossed without cost. Night fell over the plains, a sky of thick salt. In the distance, a roar echoed through the valleys, as if testing resonances. The biologist breathed in the smell of dust and oil, put the pieces back in the case, and sketched in her notebook the words she had avoided during the day. Truth on the paper, the handwriting felt heavier than usual. In the savannah, the mask still shone on the face of the wearer, and denial for now protected reputations and routines. But the web of evidence was stretched taut, and the accumulated tension promised to snap. The discoverer's isolation was part of the ritual. Looking up, she knew the next phase would not be one of assembly, but of shock. The terrain called for active investigation, and on the other side, someone was already preparing the counterattack. Night descended unhurriedly over the savannah, with an orange glow that seemed suspended in the air, as if time itself resisted advancing. Dust still hung over the trails marked during the day, and the wind carried fragments of scattered sounds, the rustle of dry leaves, the distant scratch of a twig, the isolated call of a predator. The entire territory seemed to be on watch. The tension accumulated over the previous days now pulsed invisibly, spreading between humans and animals like a fever. The biologist, exhausted and alone, studied the maps again. Every intersection of footprints, every trap coordinate, every point of electronic silence formed a network too coherent to be chance. What had previously seemed coincidental now revealed itself to be methodical. There was intelligence in the shadows. Not just the lion's cunning, but also the human calculation that had allowed the chaos. The discoveries of the previous chapter were not the end of the line. They were the opening to something deeper, more dangerous, where nature and guilt intertwined indistinguishably. The following dawn, the investigation gained momentum. A group of guards returned to the eastern area with reinforced equipment, guided by the biologist's coordinates. The search was no longer for Eric, but for the traces of his absence. They found the camp ransacked, tools abandoned, a broken radio, and half buried in the sand, a portable camera that had recorded the last hours before his disappearance. The file, corrupted in parts, showed patches of sky and dust. In a flash, the image of the white lion appeared, watching from afar, motionless, before disappearing into the shadows. The evidence previously scattered began to converge. The investigation became active, almost obsessive. Tracks were measured, footprints compared, samples collected. The biologist, guided by an instinct that blended reason and intuition, noticed that the lion seemed to anticipate human movements. It didn't just react, it acted strategically. Its movements coincided with the disruption of illegal hunting routes. The locations where traps were deactivated formed a curved line that circled the points of highest concentration of cubs. It was as if the animal mapped the danger and neutralized it before it expanded. The arrival of external allies brought a brief respite. Environmental agents from the capital brought drones and thermal images. Along with them, reporters and documentary filmmakers. For the first time, the narrative went beyond the park's perimeter. The images of the albino lion, the nighttime recordings, and the cross-referencing of tracks and disappearances transformed the case into a matter on the border between science and myth. But the more attention focused on the investigation, the closer the risks became. The savannah's borders cannot tolerate spotlights. At first, the cooperation seemed sincere. The new agents set up temporary camps, installed observation towers, and shared equipment. The biologist believed that with support and visibility, the truth would come out. But the nature of human alliances is rarely straightforward. One of the newly arrived technicians, a man who claimed to have worked in endangered species monitoring, began to spend too much time in the base's archives. He asked seemingly innocent questions, noted radio frequencies, and watched the guards' routes with excessive attention. Shortly thereafter, one of the drones disappeared in mid-flight, and the recordings of its last transmission showed only the metallic glint of something reflected on the ground before the screen faded. Betrayal loomed large. It was discovered that the coach had been financed by intermediaries linked to the trophy trade. The cooperation was a facade. He had been sent to ensure that the evidence would not become an international denunciation. While the team sought justice, the enemy infiltrated the scene disguised as an ally. And by the time the deception was revealed, it was too late. Much of the data had been erased, and one of the local guards had disappeared after going on a night patrol. The savannah at this point seemed to respond to human disorder with its own codes. Instead of chaos, it established balance through contrast. Every lie seemed to have its mirror in some gesture of nature. When man withdrew, the lion emerged. When betrayal was revealed, the land returned to silence. The wind swept dust along paths that seemed newly traced, as if the landscape itself were rearranging history. Then came the big twist. One of the remaining drones, programmed to fly over the area where Eric had last been seen, captured images that would change the course of the narrative. There was the hunter, alive, wounded, tied up, left exactly as in the opening scene of the climax. The lion once again watched from afar, motionless. The video revealed that the man had been captured not by other humans, but by a sequence of impossible-to-replicate natural coincidences. A deactivated trap accidentally closing, a landslide caused by wind, a root trapping his legs. It was as if the environment itself had orchestrated fate. The turn of events brought confusion. The guards were torn between the urge to rescue and fear. The biologist recognized with a shiver the symbolic circle engraved in the ground near the original camp. It had reappeared around the tree where the man was trapped. The same pattern, the same dimensions. It was impossible to determine whether it had been traced by human hands or by the natural marks left by the animal's hooves and claws. But its meaning was unequivocal. Nature had become the judge. As the team prepared to intervene, the lion began to move. The drone's camera tracked its movement until the connection was lost amid the dust. No one knew what happened in the hours that followed. When the sun rose again, the lion had disappeared, and the hunter remained in the same place, alive and in shock. The entire jungle seemed to be at rest. The threat had escalated to its limit and suddenly dissolved into an almost sacred silence. The evidence gathered confirmed what had previously sounded like legend. The lion was not just a symbol, it was action, the force of the savannah correcting imbalances. The human allies, unmasked, were rounded up by the authorities. The biologist, now exhausted, gazed at the white horizon and understood that the research had been not only scientific, but also moral. That sequence of events, discovery, betrayal, revelation, exposed something beyond human comprehension, the wisdom of a system that, when threatened, reacted with precision. The escalation ended not with noise, but with stillness, and in that silence the cycle was complete. The afternoon sun once again scorched the plains, restoring the landscape to its original brilliance. But nothing was the same. Beneath the surface, the savannah now bore the memory of the trial, an invisible record etched in the wind, in the footprints, in the eyes of those who survived. Balance had been restored, albeit at the cost of fear and doubt. The lion had disappeared, but its presence remained, like an unwritten law that would continue to watch over every human step in that territory. The day dawned with a pale light that drenched the savannah in an almost metallic sheen. The air held the promise of extreme heat, but at that moment it was the cold clarity that defined the plain's contours. The public stage had risen without a stage, without invitations, without artificial sounds. Yet everything seemed prepared for a trial. The guards positioned themselves at a safe distance. The vehicles cast shadows over the land, and above, birds described slow orbits. In the center of this natural amphitheater, the hunter remained tied to the tree, exhausted and motionless, like part of the very landscape he had once violated. The world observed, through lenses and attentive eyes, a truth that could no longer be diverted. The lion's approach broke the tension without breaking the silence. Its albino fur advanced against the wind, unhurriedly, imposing its own rhythm on time. There was no doubt or hesitation in its gait. An axis organized the space around it. When the animal stopped before the man, the entire savannah seemed to tilt. The mask finally gave way. There in the full light, the image of the human predator, previously protected by discourses of control, by market logic, by contracts and intermediaries, was reduced to a fragile, dust-stained body, embedded in the earth it tried to subdue. No words were needed for the fall to become evident. The hierarchy built on artifice could not withstand the simple presence of nature in a state of law. The inevitable confrontation wasn't about clashes, but about distances. The minimum distance between the lion's snout and the bound hands. The precise distance the guards maintained, aware that any interference would be a violation of the ritual. The distance between the drones, kept high enough to not disrupt the logic of the moment, and the distance, above all, between what was believed to be known and what was actually being seen. The lion inclined its head, as if measuring the line of a boundary, and the dust rose in a halo that enveloped the two protagonists. The courtroom was the ground. The sentence, the very presence of the animal there untouched, sovereign. When the roar came, an invisible dam broke. It wasn't a hunting call. It was the sound that seals cycles. The savannah responded with a silent chorus. The herds halted their steps, the hyenas retreated, the birds halted their gyrations and resumed with a new cadence. Catharsis spread among humans and animals with the density of a wave. Among the guards, the impact wasn't fear but clarity. It was understood effortlessly that the scene concluded a sequence of imbalances. Every deactivated trap, every symbol etched into the ground, every broken camera converged on that moment. The lion didn't need to touch the man to expose him. It was enough to remain. The next few minutes defined the story's course. After roaring, the lion took 2 steps back and, in a gesture that seemed to gather its own strength, turned toward the horizon. There was no triumph or ostentatious clemency. There was measure. The exact measure of someone who restores an axis and returns it to the flow of the world. The hunter remained tied, but he was no longer the center of the plot. The savannah resumed the narrative. The animal crossed the light, and its silhouette was gradually swallowed by the brightness until only a white line remained among the tall grasses, a ghost of justice inscribed in the wind. The human rescue began after the dust settled. Technicians approached cautiously, recorded the marks around the tree, and photographed the irregular circle etched in the earth, the same one that had appeared at critical points in the investigation. The man was released and, without resistance, led away under the observation of all. The recordings, combined with reports and maps, formed a dossier whose strength lay not in a single event, but in the coherence that connected distant facts. Environmental authorities, pressured by the visibility of the case, rounded up the accomplices revealed during the infiltration. Equipment was seized, documents formalized, and trafficking routes dismantled, at least long enough for the territory to breathe. The consequences weren't limited to papers and handcuffs. Farmers in border areas, alerted by the repercussions, adjusted fences and irrigation schedules to reduce conflicts. Monitoring projects were reinforced with less intrusive protocols. Nearby schools set aside a day to talk about the white lion, not as a fabricated legend, but as a real presence that had helped reorganize a place. In low, discreet conversations, intermediaries in the illegal trade moved to another state, switched off their phones, and broke off contacts. The shadow that once facilitated business now constrained, as if the landscape itself watched every step. For those who followed closely, the outcome was also intimate. The biologist, who had been isolated when she set up the evidence network, found in public clarity a silent return. There were no apologies, but there was room. Her maps returned to the central table. The radios worked when they needed to. The team, without fanfare, reallocated routes according to the geometry of care, not haste. The savannah, which offers no medals, gave her back only what it gives to those who listen, a path to continue working. The suffering of the innocent was evident in the accounting of what had been done. Animals marked by ancient scars, silent areas where births had once been heard, puddles that had become cemeteries of broken footprints. The inventory of the damage drew a map of losses that no human rescue could immediately undo. And yet, there were signs of recovery. Females crossed previously avoided corridors. Cubs explored small slopes with renewed curiosity. The afternoon was once again filled with natural scents, without the harsh cut of oil. As the sun slipped behind the hills and bathed the plain in a deep gold, the final scene unfolded effortlessly. High on a rocky outcrop, the silhouettes of herbivores cut across the horizon. The wind shredded tufts of dry grass, and the dust kicked up by small paws formed translucent veils. There was no music, no speeches, only the shallow sound of the world reassembling itself. Amid lengthening shadows, the memory of the albino lion lingered like a chalk line on stone, an ancient reminder that order is not immutable, but can be restored when the axis of the place is respected. The final reflections settled like a cool breeze after a hot day. It was learned without fanfare that truth does not depend on illustrious witnesses, but on patient coherence. It was learned that masks endure until light shines through them at just the right angle. And it was learned that justice, when it springs from the very fabric of the world, does not require spectacle. It requires presence. The encounter between the lion and the hunter would remain in the archives and in conversations, but above all, in the small daily choices of those who tread the savannah. Night finally rose, a salty sky that lit up point by point. In the distance, a roar ran through the valley like a signature. It neither announced danger nor celebration. It simply registered existence. The park fell asleep under invisible surveillance. Balance was not a promise, it was a continuous task. And if the axis ever tilted again, the memory of the white in motion would serve as a guide. The truth would emerge again, because it is the Earth's job to bring to light what has stubbornly been tried to bury. In the final shot, the ideal camera rises until the texture of the grass disappears, until the savannah becomes a drawing and the drawing a breath. The case closes without closure. The message remains simple, inevitable. The truth finds its way sooner or later, and when it arrives, it puts everything back in its place. The savannah, which has seen everything, will continue to see. And the lion, which doesn't need to be seen to exist, will remain in some fold of light, guarding the invisible line that separates the domain of greed from the territory of life.